The sound of gunfire echoed across the barren Arizona landscape like thunder rolling through hell itself. Sarah Mitchell dropped the bucket of well water she'd been carrying, her heart hammering against her ribs as the shots grew closer to her isolated homestead. 3 months had passed since her husband James had ridden away with promises of returning with supplies and a fresh start, leaving behind only empty whiskey bottles and unpaid debts. Now, as the acrid smell of gunpowder drifted on the desert wind, Sarah realized she was completely alone in a land where loneliness often meant death. She pressed herself against the rough wooden planks of her cabin wall, peering through a gap in the shutters. In the distance, dust clouds rose like ghostly spirits, and she could make out the silhouettes of riders moving fast across the scrubland. Her hands trembled as she reached for the old Spencer rifle James had left behind, though she'd only fired it twice in her life, both times missing the coyotes that had been stalking their chickens. The riders thundered past her property without stopping, their horses' hooves pounding the earth like war drums. Sarah counted 7 men, their faces grim and determined, led by someone she recognized as Marshal Henderson from the territorial capital. Behind them trailed a group of civilian volunteers, the kind of men who gathered in saloons to boast about Apache scalps and collect bounties on dead Indians. Her stomach turned as she watched them disappear over the rocky ridge that bordered her land to the south. Silence fell over the desert like a suffocating blanket. Sarah remained pressed against the wall for what felt like hours, though the position of the sun told her only 20 minutes had passed. The oppressive heat of the Arizona afternoon made sweat pool in the small of her back, and her cotton dress clung uncomfortably to her skin. She was about to step away from the window when a new sound caught her attention, something that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of labored breathing, harsh and ragged, coming from somewhere near her property. Sarah's grip tightened on the rifle as she strained to listen. There it was again, accompanied by what sounded like someone or something moving through the brush behind her chicken coop. Every instinct told her to bar the door and wait for whatever danger lurked outside to move on, but something deeper, perhaps the memory of her own desperate nights when James had failed to return with food, compelled her to investigate. She stepped out into the blazing afternoon sun, the rifle heavy in her inexperienced hands. The landscape around her homestead was harsh and unforgiving, dotted with sagebrush, prickly pear cactus, and the occasional stunted mesquite tree. Mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks crowned with snow that seemed impossibly far from the sweltering desert floor. This was land that killed the weak and tested the strong, and Sarah had learned to read its moods like a book written in dust and bone. Following the sound, she made her way around the chicken coop, stepping carefully to avoid the thorny plants that seemed to grow everywhere in this godforsaken territory. The chickens inside the coop squawked nervously, sensing her tension. As she rounded the corner of the small structure, Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. A man lay crumpled against the base of a large boulder, his body twisted in a way that spoke of tremendous pain. Blood had soaked through his clothing and pooled in the sand beneath him, creating dark stains that attracted flies in the afternoon heat. His skin was bronze-colored, weathered by sun and wind, and his long black hair was matted with sweat and dirt. Even unconscious and grievously wounded, there was something about his bearing that commanded respect, an innate dignity that seemed carved from the very stone of the desert itself. Sarah's first instinct was to run. Everyone in the territory knew the stories about Apache warriors, tales told in hushed whispers around campfires and in the safety of town saloons. They were said to be ghosts who could appear and disappear at will, able to track a man across miles of rocky ground and kill without making a sound. The newspapers from back east painted them as savage demons who showed no mercy to white settlers, especially women and children. But as she looked down at the wounded man, Sarah saw something that cut through years of fear and prejudice. He was dying. Whatever had happened in that gun battle she'd witnessed, this man had been left behind, abandoned to face death alone in the merciless desert. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and she could see at least 3 bullet wounds in his torso, each one potentially fatal without immediate medical attention. Sarah found herself thinking of her younger brother Tommy, who had died of fever when she was 16. She remembered how helpless she'd felt, watching him waste away while their mother prayed and their father paced the floor of their cabin back in Missouri. The memory of that helplessness, of standing by while someone suffered, decided her course of action. She set the rifle aside and knelt beside the unconscious man, her hands hovering uncertainly over his wounds. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. His face, relaxed in unconsciousness, held a kind of nobility that reminded her of the Roman statues she'd seen in books during her brief schooling. Scars crisscrossed his arms and chest, speaking of a life lived in constant conflict, but there was also something else, something in the set of his features that suggested this was no ordinary warrior. The largest wound was in his side, just below his ribs, where a bullet had torn through flesh and muscle. Blood continued to seep from the injury, staining the sand dark red. Sarah knew that if she was going to help him, she had to act quickly. Every minute of delay brought him closer to death, and despite everything she'd been taught about his people, she found she couldn't walk away from someone in such desperate need. Working quickly, she tore strips from her cotton petticoat, creating makeshift bandages. The man stirred slightly as she began to clean his wounds, muttering something in a language she didn't understand. His eyes fluttered open for just a moment, revealing depths of brown so dark they were almost black, and in those eyes Sarah saw not the savage fury she'd been taught to expect, but intelligence, pain, and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Then he was unconscious again, and Sarah was left alone with her racing thoughts and the enormity of what she was attempting. She managed to get him to her cabin, half carrying and half dragging his considerable weight across the 20 yards of desert that separated the boulder from her door. By the time she had him lying on her kitchen table, both of them were covered in blood and sweat, and Sarah was beginning to understand just how much danger she had placed herself in. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Sarah of the blood she'd been washing from her unexpected patient's wounds, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart stopped as she recognized the distinctive rhythm of shod hooves on rocky ground. The posse was returning, and from the sound of their approach, they were heading directly for her homestead. Sarah looked down at the unconscious Apache warrior lying on her kitchen table, his chest rising and falling with the shallow breaths of someone clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. She thought of Marshal Henderson and his men, of the bounty hunters and their talk of scalps and dead Indians. She thought of her reputation in the territory, of what would happen if word got out that she had harbored a wounded Apache in her home. But as the sound of horses grew closer and she heard the voices of men calling to each other in the gathering dusk, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would change her life forever. She threw a blanket over the wounded man and stepped out onto her porch to meet whatever fate was riding toward her across the darkening desert, knowing that some choices, once made, could never be undone. The first rider to emerge from the gloom was Marshal Henderson himself, his star glinting in the last rays of sunlight. Behind him rode 6 other men, their faces grim with the disappointment of an unsuccessful hunt. Sarah forced herself to remain calm as they approached, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. "Evening, Mrs. Mitchell," the marshal called out as he reined in his horse just a few yards from her porch. "Didn't expect to find anyone still living out here after what happened to the Johnson place last month." "Good evening, Marshal," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "What brings you out this way?" "Tracking a wounded Apache," Henderson said, his eyes scanning her property with the practiced gaze of a lawman. "Dangerous one, from what we've been told. Chief Victorio's nephew, goes by the name Black Wolf. Shot him 3 times, but the bastard managed to get away from us about 5 miles south of here." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, but she managed to keep her expression neutral. "I haven't seen anyone, Marshal. Been inside most of the day, doing washing and mending." Henderson studied her for a long moment, and Sarah was certain he could hear her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, he nodded. "Well, keep that rifle of yours close, ma'am. This one's not like the others. He's killed more white men than any Apache warrior in the territory, and he's smart enough to know that a place like this might be his best chance for shelter." As the posse rode away into the gathering darkness, Sarah remained on her porch until their voices faded completely into the desert night. Only then did she allow herself to collapse into the wooden chair James had built for her during their first month in Arizona, when they'd still believed their future lay in this harsh and unforgiving land. Inside her cabin, lying wounded and unconscious on her kitchen table, was Black Wolf, nephew of Chief Victorio, one of the most feared Apache warriors in the entire Southwest Territory. And she, Sarah Mitchell, abandoned wife and reluctant desert dweller, had just lied to a federal marshal to protect him. 3 days passed like a fever dream. Sarah had moved Black Wolf from the kitchen table to the small bed in her spare room, the one she'd prepared months ago in foolish hope that James might return with news of a child on the way. Now it sheltered a man whose very presence in her home could mean her death if discovered. She'd boiled water, torn up her last clean sheet for bandages, and used precious supplies of whiskey and salt to clean wounds that would have killed a lesser man. On the second night, his fever broke with violent chills that shook the entire bed frame. Sarah found herself sitting beside him through the dark hours, pressing cool cloths to his forehead and listening to him speak in rapid Apache, words that sounded like prayers or perhaps confessions. She caught fragments that might have been names, spoken with such anguish that she understood without translation that he was calling out to people who would never answer again. When consciousness finally returned to him on the morning of the 4th day, Black Wolf's first instinct was to reach for a weapon that wasn't there. Sarah watched from across the room as his dark eyes swept the small space, taking in every detail with the focused intensity of a predator assessing potential threats. His gaze fixed on her face, and she saw the exact moment when memory returned, when he remembered collapsing behind her chicken coop and waking to find gentle hands tending his wounds. "You should have let me die," he said, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by pain and dehydration but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Perhaps," Sarah replied, setting down the cup of broth she'd been preparing. "But I didn't." Black Wolf studied her with those unsettling dark eyes, and Sarah had the uncomfortable sensation that he was seeing straight through to her soul. "Do you know who I am?" "I know what they call you," she said carefully. "I know there's a bounty on your head and that Marshal Henderson would give his right arm to bring you in. And yet you lie to federal marshals to protect me." There was genuine puzzlement in his voice. "Why?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question for 3 days, and she still wasn't certain of the answer. "You were dying. I couldn't just walk away and let that happen." "White women have walked away from dying Apache before," Black Wolf said quietly. "They have done much worse than walk away." The weight of those words settled between them like a physical presence. Sarah thought of the stories she'd heard in town, tales of what happened when Apache raids targeted isolated homesteads. She'd always assumed those stories were complete truth, told by reliable witnesses. But looking at this man, seeing the intelligence and pain in his eyes, she began to wonder how many of those tales had been embellished by fear and prejudice. "I'm not other white women," she said finally. "No," Black Wolf agreed, his gaze never leaving her face. "You are not." Over the following days, as his strength slowly returned, Sarah learned things about her unwelcome patient that challenged everything she thought she knew about Apache warriors. He refused to eat until she had eaten first, a courtesy she hadn't expected from someone supposedly raised without civilization. When she brought him water, he thanked her in careful English, and when she changed his bandages, he endured the pain in stoic silence rather than frightening her with displays of agony. More surprising still were the moments when he thought she wasn't watching. She'd catch him staring out the small window of the spare room with an expression of such profound sadness that it took her breath away. Once, she heard him singing softly to himself, a haunting melody that seemed to carry the weight of mountains and the sorrow of wind across empty places. "Tell me about your husband," Black Wolf said one evening as Sarah brought him soup made from one of her precious chickens. The direct question caught her off guard, and she almost dropped the bowl. "What makes you think I have a husband?" "Wedding ring," he said simply, nodding toward her left hand. "But no man here. Empty cabin, no horse in the corral except that old mare. Either he is dead or he has left you." Sarah set the bowl on the small table beside the bed, acutely aware of how close she had to come to him to do so. Even wounded and weakened, Black Wolf radiated a kind of contained power that made her skin prickle with awareness. "He left," she said quietly. 3 months ago. For another woman? For gold, supposedly. There was talk of a strike in Colorado Territory. Sarah found herself telling him things she'd never spoken aloud to anyone. James always believed he was one lucky break away from being rich. He couldn't see that we had everything we needed right here. And now you are alone in Apache country with winter coming. the simple statement held no judgment, but it forced Sarah to confront the reality of her situation. Without James, she had no way to bring in the harvest from their small vegetable garden, no way to cut enough firewood to last through the cold months, no way to maintain the cabin's roof when the autumn rains began. She'd been surviving on stubbornness and the foolish hope that her husband might still return, but Black Wolf's words stripped away those comfortable illusions. "Yes," she admitted. "I am alone." "No," Black Wolf said quietly. "You are not." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah felt her cheeks flush as she met his steady gaze, seeing something there that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. This was dangerous territory, more treacherous than any desert landscape. On the 7th day, Black Wolf was strong enough to stand and walk across the room without assistance. Sarah watched from the doorway as he tested his injured side, wincing slightly but showing no other sign of the pain that must still be considerable. His recovery was remarkable, a testament to both his natural constitution and her careful nursing. "I should go," he said without turning around. "Every day I remain here increases the danger for you." "Go where?" Sarah asked. "Marshal Henderson is still searching these mountains. There are bounty hunters camped at every water source between here and Mexico. I have survived in this desert longer than most white men have been alive," Black Wolf replied. "I will find a way." "With wounds that haven't fully healed? Without supplies, weapons, or even a horse?" Sarah shook her head. "You'd be dead within 2 days." Black Wolf turned to face her, and Sarah was struck again by the natural dignity in his bearing. Even wearing James's old clothes, even weakened by injury and fever, he carried himself like a man accustomed to command. "Better my death than yours, Sarah Mitchell." It was the first time he'd spoken her name, and hearing it in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Why do you care what happens to me? You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. You lied to protect me when the truth would have been safer for you. You have shown me kindness when your own people would call such kindness treason." Black Wolf moved closer, and Sarah could see flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "In my culture, such actions create obligations that cannot be easily dismissed. And in my culture, they would call what I've done foolishness at best, treachery at worst." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I don't care about obligations, Apache or otherwise. I care that you're still not strong enough to survive alone out there." "Then what do you propose?" It was a question Sarah had been wrestling with for days, and she still wasn't certain her answer made any sense. But looking at Black Wolf, seeing the man rather than the legend, she found herself speaking words that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. "Stay through the winter," she said. "Help me prepare this place to survive the cold months. In spring, when you're fully healed and the mountain passes are clear, you can go wherever it is you need to go." Black Wolf stared at her in silence for so long that Sarah began to think she'd made a terrible mistake. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "You do not understand what you are asking. I am not just any Apache warrior, Sarah. I am Black Wolf, son of Chief Victorio's sister, war leader of the Chehen band. There are men who would burn this entire territory to capture me." "I know who you are," Sarah said quietly. "Marshal Henderson told me. And yet you still ask me to stay." "Yes." "Why?" It was the same question he'd asked days ago, and Sarah still wasn't certain she had a complete answer. But standing there in the golden light of the desert sunset, looking at a man who should have been her enemy but felt like something else entirely, she found herself speaking a truth she'd barely admitted to herself. "Because in 3 months of marriage, James never once looked at me the way you did when you thought I might leave you to die. Because in all my life, no one has ever thanked me for kindness the way you thanked me for soup and clean bandages. Because you're the first person in this godforsaken territory who's asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what I should do." Black Wolf moved closer, close enough that Sarah could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, close enough to smell the sage and desert wind that seemed to cling to his skin even after days of confinement. "And what is it that you want, Sarah Mitchell?" The question hung between them like a bridge over a chasm, and Sarah knew that once she crossed it, there would be no going back to the safety of her old life, her old certainties, her old fears. But as she looked into Black Wolf's eyes and saw not the savage demon of frontier legend but a man capable of tenderness and honor, she realized that her old life had been little more than existence anyway. "I want to not be alone anymore," she whispered. Black Wolf reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her eyes fill with unexpected tears. "Then I will stay," he said simply. "But Sarah, you must understand. The man you are sheltering has done things that would give you nightmares. I have killed men in ways that would make you sick to imagine. I am not the gentle soul you think you see. And I'm not the innocent frontier wife you think you're protecting," Sarah replied, surprising them both with the steel in her voice. "I've buried children, nursed the dying, and survived abandonment in country that kills the weak. We all carry darkness, Black Wolf. The question is what we choose to do with the light." As night fell over the desert and the first stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky, Sarah Mitchell and the man the entire territory knew as Black Wolf stood in the doorway of her isolated cabin, both of them understanding that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Outside, coyotes began their evening song, a wild and haunting melody that seemed to speak of ancient truths about survival, loyalty, and the unexpected places where the human heart finds refuge. Neither of them knew that Marshall Henderson had found tracks near the creek 2 miles south, or that he planned to return at first light with a larger posse and dogs trained to follow Apache sign. They didn't know that the bounty on Black Wolf's head had been increased to $1,000, or that word of his escape had reached all the way to the territorial governor. All they knew was that for the first time in months, perhaps years, neither of them felt completely alone in a world that had shown them little mercy. And in the harsh landscape of the American Southwest, where survival itself was never guaranteed, that was a kind of miracle worth protecting, no matter what dawn might bring.